Wild animals stay wild because they don't take well to being tamed. But if you decide to break the system, these creatures will undergo some serious changes. To make this video interesting, we had to delve into history. You know what? It was worth it. Attention, here's the most subtle request in the world to hit that like button. Just a quick tap right now. Okay, let's talk about goldfish. Nope, that's not old news. Everyone knows goldfish, probably the most famous aquarium pets out there. But they weren't always that small. And surprisingly, goldfish didn't even have their distinctive color originally. It was humans who made them like that, tinkering with breeding for over 1,000,000 years. Oops, I meant 1,000 years. The ancient Chinese were the first to tame what would later become the goldfish, originally a carp species. It was around 265 to 420 AD when they noticed these carp sprouting red scales, adding a colorful twist to their usual gray or silver appearance. Later on, people started picking out goldfish with their favorite phenotypes to grow in decorative ponds and water gardens. Over the course of a century of selection, hundreds of different body shapes, fin configurations, eye shapes, and colors emerged. This is the diversity we see today, including fish with telescope eyes, no fins, and more. During the Ming Dynasty, which spanned the 14th to 17th centuries, people started raising goldfish indoors. This allowed them to breed fish that wouldn't survive in outdoor ponds, ones completely unfit for the wild. Today, some goldfish bred through careful selection can no longer reproduce naturally due to their altered shape. They have to be bred artificially. And this seems like a pretty big change compared to the original animal. By the way, scientists really dug deep into genetics and concluded that all goldfish in China and Japan descended from the Chinese Crucian carp. It's bigger than your average fish, with a different color, tail, and fin shape. But while a carp can grow up to 25 inches long and weigh nearly 7 pounds, goldfish, well, you can imagine. Donkeys have been around even longer. They were tamed around 7,000 years ago in East Africa, which is a good 3,000 years earlier than horses. As often happens, African wild donkeys changed when they found themselves near people. They evolved to survive in semi-arid mountainous conditions with scarce food sources, inconsistent water access, and constant temperature changes. Domestic donkeys can be found worldwide, but they prefer warm, dry places. Nowadays, there are 8 different breeds of domestic donkeys, and on average, they're a bit smaller than their wild cousins. Besides weight and height, domestic donkeys also lost their unique coloring. All wild subspecies sport a subtle dark stripe across their back, and some even have stripes on their legs, reminiscent of zebras. The domestic ones seem rather unremarkable at first glance. Donkeys really haven't changed all that much compared to cows. Nowadays, scientists think that domestic cattle descended from an ancient wild ox called the aurochs. These beasts stood about 6 feet tall at the shoulders, making them some of the biggest plant-eating animals of the Holocene epoch. Aurochs also sported hefty, elongated horns reaching up to 31 inches in length, long, slender legs, a lean physique with strong muscles, especially in males, and females had small udders. Aurochs were first tamed around 10,500 years ago, and it happened a few times. After that, the animal began to change. Some modern breeds of large cattle still exhibit traits reminiscent of aurochs, like their dark coloring and a light stripe along the back. And of course, they still have hooves, horns, and the overall bovine body structure, but it's just the general resemblance. People have altered the genetic makeup of large horned cattle more than anyone else for their own benefit. As a result, the lifespan of animals that were once wild is significantly decreased, but milk productivity has greatly increased. These animals can now thrive in conditions that their wild ancestors would have never been able to handle. But humans have altered the cattle genotype too much. They've even bred hornless cows, which are considered safer because they don't injure each other. So there's not much left of the lean physique of ancient bulls, especially when you see the massive breeds deliberately bred for size. Seriously, they're massive. But it's all about meat. Experts believe some of these bulls could tip the scales at a whopping 3,300 pounds. For comparison, Brahman bulls raised for meat in the U.S. might hit, well, about 2,200 pounds. Belgian blue cows can occasionally reach 2,600 pounds, but they're nowhere near the size of those ancient bulls. Each of these cows has a different build and a different role, though. Goats got their share too. Scientists think that modern goats were domesticated from bezoars in Western Asia around 9 to 10,000 years ago. This domestication process quickly boosted both the speed of evolutionary development and the genetic diversity of the goat population. Currently, there are 300 breeds registered, each suited for various purposes. Of course, they've changed a lot, from their behavior and body shape to even how their whole system functions. As agricultural communities developed and grain crops became the main food for both people and domestic animals, goats developed resistance to fungal toxins. Around 8,000 years ago, people began selecting animals based on size, fertility, udder shape, and color. Different communities had their preferences for wool colors and patterns. Some traits became more prominent and evolved over time. Take the ancient Egyptians, for example. They really liked animals with long ears and no horns. It's easy to tell wild goats apart from domestic ones. Wild goats have straight ears, while many domestic goats around the world have long, droopy ears, possibly thanks to the Egyptians. Wild goats sport distinctive horns that curve backward with sharp edges, while many domestic goats have horns that spiral. And let's not forget about the differences in their wool. Most domestic goats have amber-colored eyes, but some Nigerian dwarf goats have blue ones. The diversity doesn't stop there. People keep breeding new breeds with different traits. Pufferfish have quite an unusual history, and they're pretty unique creatures with their reduced skeletons, beak-like teeth, and spines. Scientists were quite intrigued by how these spines came to be, and recently they finally got an answer. It turns out the spines aren't scales. Their development process is linked to the same set of genes responsible for feathers and fur in other vertebrates. Pufferfish don't have scales at all. Remember that story about the pigs escaping from the farm and turning wild in no time? Well, this is kind of like that, almost. By blocking certain genes, you can reduce the number of spines and determine the area of a fish covered by these spines. Normally, spines are located in certain areas, and there's a reason for that. When a pufferfish puffs up by gulping water or sometimes air, its skin stretches, especially around its belly, making it more vulnerable to damage. The spines reinforce the swollen belly. In extreme cases, some pufferfish lose all other spines on their bodies and keep only the abdominal ones. Despite fish's best efforts to protect themselves, they often end up as someone's meal. You're probably aware of a traditional Japanese dish made from poisonous pufferfish. It's considered a delicacy, and even though chefs are trained to prepare the fish so its toxins won't kill anyone, people still occasionally die from it. In 2004, researchers at Nagasaki University successfully bred non-toxic pufferfish. It's believed that the fish's poison comes from a neurotoxin called tetrodotoxin, which accumulates in bacteria and small marine creatures it consumes. The toxin is mainly concentrated in the liver, gonads, and skin. However, if you keep the fish away from other marine life and feed them clean food, the toxin doesn't show up. That way, the dish is totally safe. Restaurants serve this fish, and it's pricier than usual because of the extra effort required to raise such specimens. Essentially, it's like having pet pufferfish that are raised in hot springs, fed a special diet, and all that stuff. If we keep breeding them like this for long enough, does it mean we'll eventually end up with a domesticated type that's completely non-toxic? Well, maybe in a couple thousand years or so. Okay, pufferfish are very specific animals after all. All right, let's talk about something more common, like horses. After they were domesticated, horses evolved to have sturdier spines, making it more comfortable for people to ride them, especially in fancy riding breeds. They have tall, long necks with a lengthy poll. It's not just about appearance, it also makes it simpler to control the horse. To keep a long neck held high, horses need high withers. Comparing domestic and wild horses can be tricky since truly wild ones have been considered extinct for a while now. However, we can look at the Przewalski's horse. Its neck is short, low, and a bit stocky, with low and subtly defined withers. A low neck can be convenient in its own way. Closer to the ground, it's easier to graze. Domestic horses, especially purebred ones, don't need to lean down as much. They also have longer legs and a lighter body. Wild horses have shorter legs and a bulky belly, which helps them stay balanced and stable in the wild. Additionally, domestic horses typically have much less fur than wild ones, unless they belong to a particularly fluffy breed. It's simple. When you live with humans, you don't have to worry about freezing in the winter. What matters most is that horses experience something called the domestication syndrome. It defines a set of qualities that domestic animals develop through human intervention in breeding. For example, humans favored less aggressive traits, so domestic horses tend to be born with a more mellow temperament. Fun fact, salmon, in fact, is almost an endangered species. It's kind of odd, right? Especially since it's so readily available in stores. But that's mostly because we eat the domesticated kind. The story of domesticating Atlantic salmon started just about half a century ago, in 1971, thanks to Norwegian scientist Trygve Girdrum and his team. They used selective breeding to grow salmon with desired traits, mostly focusing on faster growth. As a result, after 7 generations, which is around 14 years, the salmon began to grow twice as fast. And that's when things really took off. Another company has managed to grow salmon that can be farmed year-round, unlike wild salmon, which only have 2 seasons. Plus, they grow even faster than regular farm salmon. But as it often happens, the traits that make these domesticated salmon grow quickly also make them unfit to survive in their natural habitat. Over 15 generations in captivity, salmon have developed smaller eyes because bigger ones became pointless. It's just not worth the energy to grow them when you don't need sharp vision in captivity. But if one of these salmon ends up in a river, it'll either starve or become someone's meal. Because farm salmon grow faster, they end up being larger than their wild kin. And that's definitely a plus for people. Genetically modified salmon of commercial size reach maturity in 16 to 18 months, rather than the usual 3 years in the wild. They also grow about 11 times faster in their first year of life. However, these modifications do affect their behavior. Farm-raised salmon aren't as good at swimming and burn more energy doing it, probably because their muscle fibers are smaller than those of wild salmon. But when their destiny is to end up as a steak, it doesn't really matter how fast they swim, right? The domestication of pigs followed a similar path, occurring separately about 9,000 to 10,000 years ago in 2 different regions, eastern Anatolia and central China. After that, pigs gradually made their way across the globe. You can easily tell a wild boar apart from a farm pig, especially by looking at their teeth. Wild boars typically have wider and longer tusks compared to farm pigs. And of course, domestic boars are noticeably larger than their wild cousins, especially since farm pigs are bred to be big. Animals have lost their distinctive traits because no farmer wants hairy pigs with an attitude and dangerous tusks that are always trying to escape. So that's why pet pigs don't have fur. They're social creatures and feel comfortable in groups, not fearing people or seeing them as enemies. On the other hand, wild boars and pigs, having lived without human interaction for generations, view us as predators and act accordingly. And it's kind of hard to blame them. Apart from being smaller in size, wild pigs are also sleeker and more muscular compared to their domestic counterparts. They have well-developed shoulders and neck, along with longer and coarser fur. Their long snouts and tusks, small ears, and straight tails with bushy tips are all features that you won't find in domestic pigs. It's intriguing that despite being domesticated for thousands of years, domestic pigs still have their tusks. But why would they need them when there are no predators to defend against on farms? Perhaps it's because domestic pigs have been constantly interbred with wild ones, sometimes intentionally, sometimes accidentally, but in the end, the genes of their wild relatives are still quite strong, and these genes whisper, "Grow tusks. They'll come in handy." If people want pigs without tusks, they just need to stop breeding pigs with tusks altogether. That means picking pigs with small tusks or none at all and only breeding them. Considering how many pigs are raised worldwide, how much pork people eat, and the money involved in this business, don't hold your breath for tuskless pigs. Moreover, pigs couldn't care less whether they have tusks or not. But with elephants, it was a different story. Between 1977 and 1992, 90% of elephants in Mozambique were killed because people wanted their ivory tusks. This meant that elephants with bigger tusks suffered the most. However, as a result, females without tusks started appearing more frequently in the area. About a third of young female elephants, the generation born after 1992, never developed tusks. Typically, only 2 to 4% of female African elephants are born without tusks, but in just a couple of decades, that number has jumped to 32%. Similarly, in other areas, male elephants born after 1995 had tusks that were 21% smaller compared to those born in the 1960s. And it's all for the same reason. Basically, if an animal really needs to get rid of a certain characteristic and its survival directly depends on it, the change happens quickly.